Hey Froggy friends, Kirostyle here. Welcome to another video. Yesterday we finished the Ace Attorney Investigations Collection games on stream, and since we finished, I want to take some time and go over some of the development blogs. Now, there's one specific development blog from the Great Ace Attorney I want to visit today, and it's a really good one, and it's going to lead into another article that they wrote for Ace Attorney Investigations Collection. So we're going to go back and revisit this. So these are dev blogs from the Great Ace Attorney Chronicles, which came out leading up to the release of that game. And there's 8 different articles here, and they're all really good. I actually went over these on stream with Kieran on his channel, where we went over all of these. There's 8 of them. And they're all really informative about the game development process and a lot of things that people go through when it comes to making games, and some of the specific troubles that they had for all sorts of things, especially with localization when it came to this game. Now, I want to go over one article in particular with you guys today, and that's Volume 2, The Adventure of the Great Ace Attorney Localization. Again, you can find these on the Ace Attorney website. So this article is written by the Localization Director, Janet Hsu, who does most of the Ace Attorney localizations, and she's really good because I really like her idea of what localization means to her. Now, if you search online, a lot of gamers tend to be afraid of the word localization. They say, no, we don't want localization. We want direct translations only to preserve the games the way we want, which I think is a valid sentiment. But the reality of the situation is that no matter how you translate something, there's going to be some level of localization, whether it be language-specific idioms or phrases that you need to find a way to translate, and also cultural things as well. And some people might prefer they just keep everything completely intact by using the original words with little like footnotes on the bottom of it, you know, like the whole everything's going according to keikaku, asterisk, keikaku means plan. But the reality is you can't just have asterisks and subtitles on every single thing in your game, otherwise it would just be too much, and it's also a little intrusive. So there's always going to be some level of localization. Now, localization is not a bad thing. A lot of people make it out to be a bad thing because they think it changes the meaning of the series that they enjoy. Now, localization is like a spectrum of like good localization and bad localization, because there's definitely bad localizations that translate things and completely change the way certain things are interpreted, whether it be certain character personalities or certain events in said game or anime, or even just completely changing the script altogether. Like, you know, when I think of bad localizations, I think of stuff like Ghost Stories, which is infamous for when they brought it over to the West, the localization team, the dubbing team was kind of just like, well, you can just do whatever you want with it, and they just kind of made it into this ridiculous comedy with very inappropriate things, which is completely unlike what the original context was. Or I think of things like the original Sengoku Basara coming over to the West and becoming Devil Kings, where they tried to erase every single mention of Japanese history, and instead of taking place in Japan, it was taking place in like a fantasy world that happened to resemble some of Japan, and then they changed every character's name into some kind of like code name instead. Like Yukimura became Scorpion, which of course he has nothing to do with scorpions, other than the fact that he wields 2 spears, which I guess could be stingers, but he's supposed to be like a tiger, right? Because that's what like the theme of his group is. Anyways, what I'm trying to say is there's good localization and there's bad localization, and people tend to hate or stay away from the word localization altogether because they just think of bad localization. And that's not always the case. Localization can be really good as well, and done very respectfully. I think about on Twitter, there was one post going around at one point where there was a Twitter user who was a localizer from some game, and they tweeted out, the best part of localization is seeing what you can get away with. And of course, a lot of people took issue with that because they're like, what do you mean get away with? You're changing things and trying to slip in memes and things that you think are funny that we don't like. And a lot of people point towards that as, we don't like localizers. This is a bad attitude to have. This is what they're all like, which is not true. So let's go through this article by Janet Hsu. And after this video is over, I'm going to go over another article that was written for Ace Attorney investigations collection that is also about localization, but this one's specifically about The Great Ace Attorney, which is one of my first games I streamed as a VTuber. So again, this is The Adventure of the Great Ace Attorney Localization by Localization Director Janet Hsu. So I'm going to read this word for word and insert my own little comments here and there, but I think she does a really good job of explaining, so I don't think I need to add in too much extra stuff. But I want to put this video up on my YouTube channel because I think it's very educational, and I think it's something that a lot of people don't always think about. So it says, "Hi everyone, it's Janet Hsu, Localization Director of the Great Ace Attorney Chronicles again, here today to talk a little about the localization of this long-awaited game." And of course, if you play this game or know about it, this game takes place in Meiji-era Japan and Victorian England. However, the difficulty of that is that the Ace Attorney franchise, the regular mainline games, those take place in Japan. When they localize it, they change the location to Los Angeles, which worked at first, but then realized later on it's a little difficult because a lot of the Ace Attorney franchise references very Japanese-specific things, and then suddenly it was like, oh, we have to explain how this is happening in California, even though it's supposed to be happening in Japan. Like, you'll notice they're very tongue-in-cheek about it in later games. For example, when games start mentioning things like yokai or rakugo theater, they'll just start acting like as if these are things that are very prevalent in Californian everyday life as a joke, because they know that it's not really taking place in California. A lot of the localizers generally refer to that area as Japanifornia, like a fictional version of California where Japanese culture is very prevalent everywhere. But Great Ace Attorney takes place in actual Meiji Japan and also Victorian England, so they had to find a way to bridge that gap. I mentioned in a recent interview that my guiding philosophy for the localization of this title was authentic yet accessible, and I thought I'd expand on that a little more here. And I love that term, authentic yet accessible. I've long thought that unlike medical or legal translation, translating and localizing for video games is sort of an art, a balancing act of faithfulness to the literal words of the original text and correctly conveying the intentions behind them in a way that the audience can connect with. So people say like localization is an art. I agree with her, especially if you continue reading this article. But a lot of people will take issue with that term online, localization being an art, thinking that no, localization is just a direct translation, or it should be, and we should be able to just use like an AI to do it instead of real people. And you'll see as we read this article why I think that kind of falls apart. This also means each game, or indeed any piece of entertainment media, has its own needs and limitations. What sort of game is it? Action? Adventure? Who is the intended audience, and what should they be expected to know going in, etc. As with any form of art, what's considered best practices also changes over time, as they are based on contemporary cultural sensibilities. Therefore, the concept of authentic yet accessible can mean different things in different contexts. For example, I was reading an English translation of a real-life Japanese author Soseki Natsume's I Am a Cat the other day, and I was taken aback by one of his feline characters talking about his owners making a penny a tail and having collected about half a crown off his hard work catching rats. But British English translation I was reading is from 1972 and was primarily for a Western audience with no access to the internet. Therefore, it would seem that back then even simple things like monetary values were localized to ensure the reader could more readily grasp a sense of the amount of money being discussed, despite the story's Japanese setting. And while this is something most translators wouldn't do nowadays because best practices have changed over time, the funny thing is, even with the slight loss of authenticity, converting Japanese monetary values into British ones has held up remarkably well in one respect as a localization choice. It made the English translation more accessible to me as a reader in the year 2021, over 40 years later, because of my familiarity with Victorian monetary values. Thanks, period dramas. Having read Soseki's original 1905 novel in Japanese as well, I can tell you I had no idea how much 5 sen or 1 yen 50 sen is worth off the top of my head, and neither does the average Japanese person, it would seem. To me, this is a case of favoring accessibility over authenticity, which is certainly one way to assign weight to those opposing elements. These sorts of balancing decisions are made all the time whenever a piece of work is translated, let alone localized. But I have a feeling that even Soseki himself wouldn't have minded these sorts of liberties being taken with his work. In fact, there's a pretty famous story about our favorite mustached cat novelist and his own translation philosophy. In episode 6 of Escapades, we have this recounting of the well-known tale. So Natsume Soseki was a real-life Japanese author who traveled to England, studied there, and then went back to Japan and wrote some stories. He is a character in The Great Ace Attorney, because The Great Ace Attorney does include a few historical figures. So here's a scene from episode 6 of Escapades from that game. So Susato says, if you had to translate the English phrase, I love you, into Japanese, what would it become? Ryunosuke says, that's easy. Aishiteru, or suki desu. Susato says, wrong, according to Mr. Natsume's teachings at least. So what's wrong with the answer Ryunosuke provided? Well, let's have Professor Soseki explain his thinking to us. He says, yes, of course, your research was very thorough. I always used to tell my students that we Japanese don't express ourselves that way. Rather, we might say, Tsuki ga kirei desu na. So Shom says, Tsuki ga kirei desu ne would translate as, the moon is beautiful, isn't it? As Shom rightly points out, Tsuki ga kirei desu ne is hardly what your textbook would tell you to translate I love you as. Still, there's a very good reason. Susato. The point is that we Japanese are reticent when it comes to expressing our emotions. We prefer to show our feelings of adoration, our tsuki, by appreciating the beauty of the moon, the tsuki. So Shom says, using tsuki to express tsuki. It's an amusing play on words, I see. Soseki says, no, or in our language you might understand better. Bad Shoms. Bad Shoms indeed, because the underlying message Soseki was trying to convey is that in translating something you have to take cultural sensibilities of the target language into account as well. In this case, the more suitable localization in his mind is the more oblique and poetic one that better aligns with the Japanese spirit of the time in its rendering of such a declaration. In doing so, he not only preserved the romantic nature of the phrase, but also made it accessible in a way that his fellow countrymen would prefer. So you see, he too would have to have made such calculations between authenticity and accessibility in his translations over 100 years ago. But wait, that's not all there is to this particular in-game passage, so let's buckle up for a little localization. You'll notice that Ryunosuke's answer was Aishiteru, or suki desu. But as those of you who are already familiar with the legend of Soseki and the beautiful moon know, it's often said that the translation his student used is Ware kimi wo aisu. In fact, that's what the original Japanese text of this scene said. So then why did we change that in the English version if it's meant to be a Japanese phrase? Well, this is because of two big factors. One, to use a phrase that some people in our audience might possibly recognize thanks to anime or basic Japanese 101 class as opposed to something no one would know unless they've had extensive Japanese training or were a Soseki mega fan. Or two, to set up two big wordplays that are coming up by defining these words in advance for people who don't know Japanese at all. In my greed, I want to make sure that the phrase was still Japanese to keep it as authentic as possible, but the direction the dialogue ultimately goes, it wouldn't have mattered what I wanted if I couldn't figure out a way to translate this passage for people with no knowledge of Japanese. It was also important to me that they too could understand the little jab Shomes takes at ski and ski by saying it's merely a clever bit of wordplay, which was a joke in the original Japanese text. So I used Ryunosuke's line as a way to set up what's to come. As for the word aishiteru, that comes up later again, but a little bit later in that escapade. This entire episode was a nightmare of an exercise in localization. I even had to sketch out how all the wordplays linked and how to tackle them beforehand. Why did you do this to me, Takumi-san? But this also brings up an interesting dilemma I had this time around. The mainline games feature a character by the name of Phoenix Wright, but this new game's protagonist didn't even have an English name yet. What was I to do? On one hand, I would have continued with the approach I'd used for the mainline games and gone the complete localization route, completely favoring accessibility over authenticity, but instead I chose to go in almost the complete opposite direction and favor authenticity over accessibility, because the needs of the narrative willed it so. Here was a character whose identity and story is entirely grounded in his Japanese nationality, so while it was already my preference to keep him Japanese, the situation left me with no doubt in my mind he had to be Ryunosuke Naruhodo. So, like Phoenix Wright, that's his name in the English version, but in the Japanese version he has a different name that is completely Japanese. But they changed it to be accessible for the English audience because of the wordplay and the puns they use in the names of the mainline Ace Attorney games, which take place in Japanifornia. With his name squared away, the next question to answer was, will he still be Phoenix's ancestor? To which my immediate response was, yes, of course. Perhaps you're wondering how I could reconcile the two characters' backgrounds so easily, but as an Asian American, the answer couldn't be plainer. Why couldn't Phoenix have Japanese ancestry when he lives in such a multicultural country in the first place? In a way, in reconciling the American setting of the first game with the Japanese elements I had to keep in the subsequent games, I suppose the America of Ace Attorney has become something more of an idealized version of itself for me. Maybe that's part of me that wishes I could have grown up in such a place as well, as it reflects a bit of my lived experiences in its unique blend of East meets West. As you can see from just these few examples, this is why I find it very hard to directly compare one localization's approach to another. Due to external factors surrounding the localization itself, such as the target language and culture or era in which it's being made, and the philosophy of the translator or localizer, each localization is crafted in a way that best caters to its goals and needs. It's the reason why things like the American versions, or localizations if you will, of TV shows like The Office and Shameless exist, despite the originals being in English, and why modern translations of Shakespeare exist since time has changed the English language itself so much that his works have become inaccessible in some ways to the average modern reader. But enough philosophy, let's take a look at a few more in-game examples. So here, Shom says, an Indian curry, perhaps. So, let's read it through in the English version. Ryunosuke, Mr. Sholmes, what do you make of this? Sholmes, shh, quiet! When I'm ruminating in the course of my deductions, nothing must disturb my mind. Oh, so sorry. An Indian curry, perhaps. What's he ruminating about? The lunch menu? So this is an interesting example of localizing intent while staying authentic to the story and character. In the Japanese, Sholmes guesses that perhaps they'll be having they'll have curry rice for lunch. However, the translators flagged this as strange, since curry rice is what we in the West would call a distinctly Japanese dish. It also seemed out of character for Sholmes to reference it so offhandedly as an Englishman. The thing is, curry rice has a bit of an interesting history. It was the British who first introduced Indian curry to Japan in the mid-19th century, but it didn't become the popular dish it is today until the early 20th century after its formal adoption by the Japanese Army and Navy. That's when it really took off and evolved into the altogether Japanese dish it is today. So when a Japanese player reads Sholmes saying he deduces that today's lunch will be curry rice, the idea being presented is he's thinking of a non-Japanese food that's commonly considered Indian in their minds. But without this cultural background, it's hard to see why Sholmes would suddenly mention curry rice. That's why in the English version, we've gone with Indian curry, since that is the actual roots of the curry rice mentioned in the Japanese version and fits better with the image of Sholmes as a British man to an English-speaking audience. Here's another interesting example of adding a little authenticity to the British setting for the English version. The juror number 5 says, Nibble, nobble, guilty bobble, nibble not guilty out. Nibble, nobble, guilty bobble, nibble not guilty out. Susato says, perhaps it's akin to fortune-telling with flower petals, like people do back home. Ryunosuke says, so Professor Harebrain's fate is to be decided by a cob of corn. So similar to Eeny, Meeny, Miny, Mo, this little ditty that the country girl sings as she typewriters her way through Colonel Cobb is based on the English schoolyard counting song Ibble Obble. The Japanese text simply has the girl repeating guilty, not guilty over and over, but with this simple addition, the translators added a little London flavor and turned her guilty, not guilty chant into an even more mysterious set of words to Ryunosuke and Susato's ears, thus making their confused response all the more fitting. By the way, the flower fortune-telling game, Hana Urainai, that Susato mentions is actually remarkably similar to He Loves Me Not flower game in the West, and just like its English counterpart, is said to have originated from the French game Effeuille la Marguerite. On the topic of adding more authentic English flavor, the translators did absolutely amazing job of adding touches that I, as an American, would never have been able to do, no matter how familiar I am with things British. From the outset, I told the translators they could write as Britishly as they pleased, and I'll be here to dial things like grammar and phrasings back as necessary to ensure accessibility to a wider international audience. So beyond just witty quips, you can bet there are pun runs and alliterations galore. On the flip side, for the episode set in Japan, we tried to preserve the original Japanese flavor, and I even went so far as to keep the graphics untouched. Instead, I asked the programmers to implement a special subtitle system for the court record, so you mouse over a piece of text that are meant to be legible for a Japanese player, a translation would pop up on screen as a subtitle. This is only possible thanks to being on current-gen hardware, as there definitely would not have enough system memory to pull this off in previous versions. We also use the honorific san and the English titles Mr. and Miss to differentiate when characters are thinking or speaking in Japanese versus English. In this way, I strove to bring out the turbulent clash of cultures feel of the Meiji era that was present in the Japanese version. To bring out the period feel even further, we took cues from the Japanese text, where complicated or period kanji characters were often used, and then labeled with a modern reading above it in smaller furigana characters to keep the text accessible to the player. Restaurants were literally Occidental food halls, or yoshikudo, but the kanji characters are labeled with a furigana reading that spells out the modern word restaurant. Another thing the Japanese did was use more dated speaking patterns. One notable example is the way Ryunosuke says "I wonder" in Japanese. In modern Japanese, kashira is a construction that pretty much only women or people who want to sound feminine will use. But in the Meiji era, it was used by anyone and everyone. One of our Japanese team members this time actually wrote this up as a bug, because it's such an unusual phrase for a male character to say in a modern game. Needless to say, it was a little surreal when it was me who had to school him by sending the bug back with "It's period appropriate, LOL." The game's writer and director, Mr. Takumi, talked about this once in an interview where he mentioned how he had to balance real Meiji-era speak with what would be fun to read for a modern audience, ending with a sort of faux Meiji middle ground style. In this way, the translators and I set out to construct our own faux Victorian style by doing things like using mostly Victorian words and grammar, and he or she in place of singular they, when a character's identity was unknown, which turned out to be a lot harder to do because we were also used to singular they. Japanese names were also written in English order, first name, surname. This is because back then, this would have been the expected way to write a Japanese name in English. But what about the way we chose to spell their names? Well, of course, we use an internationally recognized romanization convention to represent Japanese sounds with Latin alphabet letters. But did you know there are multiple Romaji systems? Many people throughout time have tried their hands at creating one, but the predominant system used today is known as the Hepburn system, developed by James Hepburn in the 1860s. This is perhaps the one you learned in your Japanese class, but even within the system, there are a number of standardized deviations. We chose to go with a variant of modified or revised Hepburn for a number of reasons, but the four big ones were 1. Conserving space, 2. Increasing readability for people who are unfamiliar with Japanese words and how to pronounce them, 3. Avoiding font support issues, and 4. Preserving the intent of the original Japanese dev team, who spelled the characters' names in the same way we presented them in the final English version. For those of you who know Japanese, have looked at how Ryunosuke and Asogi are spelled and thought, what happened to the extra U's that should be in there? Why were they dropped? The answer is simple, that in the variation we chose, we're supposed to drop unpronounced vowels such as the U's in this case. This more streamlined style, which is used by the Japanese government itself for English information signage around Japan, makes it a ton easier for people who don't know what the extra letter's real function is, and increases the chance that they'll pronounce it correctly on their first try. It also saves us a letter on screen, where every usable pixel is a big deal. But then why not use macrons and spell their names as Ryunosuke and Asogi instead, with the little accents over the U and the O? Is probably your next question, I'll bet. This is where the technical side of things comes into play. Not every typeface comes with every glyph or letter that's used in European languages. This is especially true of Asian language-based fonts. In fact, just to use the N dash, the UI designer and I had to merge that glyph into the main text font from another typeset that was similar looking enough to pass muster. You do not want to know how many fonts I had to look through on that day in search of one tiny dash. It's also the reason why ultimately we had to go with Esmeralda instead of Esmeralda for Madame Tussauds, since one of our fancier fonts in the game doesn't contain the accent aigu E letter, or the E acute. In French, it's called accent aigu, which is why I call it that. So you can see in some of these font faces here. Speaking of UI troubles, there were a ton of other changes we had to make, not the least of which was to speed up the typewriter text here and there due to the sheer number of letters we need to display. But increasing the speed of the text caused the tail end of the typewriter sound effects to get clipped, so I had new custom ones made for the English version. If you got good ears and are familiar with the Japanese version, you just might be able to hear what I'm talking about when you play the game for yourself. Phew, I talked a lot today, but there's still more to come. Next time, I'll be taking a look at how we recorded the English dub in the middle of a pandemic. Until then. So, as you can see from this article, there's so many things they have to keep in mind that you probably didn't think of. Things like font faces with the accents, or the amount of space they had on screen, or the sound effects for the typewriter going off at the same time as the letters, or things like localizing even within the same language, like Victorian era English with regular modern English, or current day Japanese with Meiji era Japanese. So even just localizing between time periods was different, or considering things like the monetary value of the money. So I think when she says authentic yet accessible, I totally agree, because if it was a direct translation all around, like I'm not even talking about losing out on things like the wordplay, but things like, nursery rhymes and money values would be a lot less accessible to a modern day reader without having to stop and do some research here and there as we go. So I totally agree with her stance on the way localization is supposed to be and how you can localize things while also keeping it authentic, but also making changes to make things accessible, which is a nice balance between the two. So the next time you think about localization, and when you come across either a really good localization or a really bad localization, just think to yourself, what do you think that was going through the minds of the devs going through this? What was their intention? Why do you think this localization was not good? And why do you think it might be good? And why do you think they made some of those decisions? Because sometimes it's a little bit more in-depth than a simple black and white answer of localization good or localization bad. It's a spectrum. And depending on what type of game you're localizing or anime that you're localizing, that might look a little differently. And the person at the helm of the ship might make different decisions than someone else. But don't think that all localization is bad. Don't think that localization is something to be condemned. Because on some level, we do need some of it. And on some level, we also can't avoid all of it. Well, thank you so much for listening to me today. I'm going to make another video going over another localization blog by Janet coming from Ace Attorney Investigations collection. So stay tuned next time. Bye, Froggy friends.